"Your methods are outdated and ineffective," declared the man, his gaze fixed intently on the framed MBA certificate on the wall, as if it provided all the justification he needed. "My name is David McAllister, 58 years old, and until 10 minutes ago, I was the Senior Systems Administrator at St. James Hospital in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. For 15 straight years, I maintained the digital lifeline of a 300-bed facility. Yet now, in this small conference room reeking of stale coffee, Simon Caldwell, the new director who's been here all of 4 months and has virtually zero medical experience, is sat behind the polished wooden desk that used to belong to a senior physician, dismissing my dedication as a hindrance to modern approaches. Standing beside him was Connor, a consultant who couldn't seem to tear his eyes away from his phone, likely itching to broadcast the news of my ousting on LinkedIn. In a matter of 20 minutes, every ounce of intellectual effort and passion I had poured into keeping this hospital system up and running through everything from a crippling ransomware scare in 2018 to a massive power outage in 2020 was powered by dismissed, with a neat severance package, 2 months' pay, and a non-disclosure agreement. As I signed the papers and unclipped the employee badge from around my neck, I couldn't help but recall the countless times I'd rushed in at midnight to prevent system crashes, the punishing 80-hour work weeks forced by budget cuts, and all those sacrifices I made with my family just so the hospital's heartbeat never skipped. Simon, wearing a frosty smile, insisted that change was absolutely necessary, while Connor hovered by my chair, eager to stake his claim, despite never once having asked how the dozens of interconnected platforms actually fit together. Finally, escorted by security, I left the building, passing by the nurses who'd once phoned me at 3 a.m. during emergencies, past the scheduling department whose corrupted database I had painstakingly rebuilt not too long ago. Placing a cardboard box with a few family photos in the passenger seat of my car, I realized that what they truly wanted wasn't the depth of my experience or the countless skills I had acquired over 15 years, but rather the complete absence of my presence, and one last glance at the hospital's entrance told me that, in their eyes, my years of service had become obsolete in the face of a shiny, new vision. If you want to see how someone who poured heart and soul into an organization gets pushed to the brink and then fights to reclaim the recognition they deserve, don't look away. Stick around to witness how these events unfold and whether justice will prevail in this world where ambition and profit often reign supreme. It would be exactly 1 week before they realized what they had lost. Although at that moment, sitting in my truck with a cardboard box of fading family photos on the passenger seat, I had no way of knowing just how quickly things would unravel in my absence. I only understood the hollow feeling in my chest, the abrupt emptiness that had replaced the 15 years I spent tending to every digital vein and artery that kept St. James Hospital alive. The memory of that final day, with Director Caldwell handing me the severance agreement he believed would buy out my loyalty, or at least my silence, lingered like the bitter aftertaste of burnt coffee. Yet, as much as his words stung, what hurt more was the thought that I had become invisible the moment a modern vision stepped into the building, overshadowing everything I had built with a single stroke of the pen. I first joined St. James shortly after my 50th birthday, which should have been a time for cautious optimism instead of desperation, but life rarely unfolds as we plan. My wife Catherine's cancer treatments had drained most of our savings, and my transition from private tech into healthcare was never truly my dream. It was, however, the best chance for stable insurance and a steady paycheck when the economy tanked. Looking back, I realize I was naive enough to think it would be just another job, a temporary stop until I got back on my feet. But St. James changed me. In those early days, I stumbled through acronyms and protocols and discovered that hospital technology is not merely about software or server uptime. It's about protecting real human lives in real time. Every glitch, every downtime, every patch I had to perform at 3 a.m. meant the difference between a seamless operation and a critical delay in patient care. During my first few years, I worked under Dr. Harrison, the old director who believed in the power of reliability above all else. He wasn't impressed by flashy dashboards or corporate lingo, and he always told me that you can't take a risk on fancy new toys if they compromise the lives of patients who depend on the system every second of every day. His words resonated with me on a deeply personal level, especially when Catherine's condition worsened. On nights I stayed too late, chasing down elusive bugs or manually patching old interfaces that refused to communicate with the newer modules. Dr. Harrison would drop by with a tired smile and a kind word. He wasn't just a boss, he was a mentor who reminded me that technology in healthcare must first and foremost be dependable. In the end, that principle guided every change I made to St. James's labyrinth of interconnected platforms. Over the years, I became so entwined with that hospital's digital infrastructure that I almost forgot there was a world outside those fluorescent-lit hallways. I learned which firewalls to reinforce and which servers needed an extra layer of backup, but I also learned the personal quirks and stories of the nurses and doctors who placed their trust in me. Nurse Jacobs from oncology always had a cup of coffee waiting during those overnight maintenance sessions, and Dr. Patel from cardiology never failed to show up with donuts as a small thanks whenever I pulled an all-nighter to stabilize the crucial data feed for patient monitoring. Even the janitor, Louise, would keep me company with gentle banter about her grandchildren while I rebooted the pharmacy system at 2 a.m. St. James became my second home, and in many ways, my only real home after Catherine passed away and my daughter Megan moved halfway across the country for college. It's not easy to look back on all the missed family moments I sacrificed in the name of protecting those servers and databases that quietly drove the entire hospital's operations. I vividly recall working through the night to prevent the system from collapsing during the ransomware scare of 2018, which threatened to lock out patient files and critical care instructions, not to mention risking the potential leak of sensitive data. I also remember the tense hours during the power grid failure of 2020, when I had to improvise a bridging solution with the backup generators to keep the ventilators running and the ER lights burning, all while ignoring the throbbing headache from a lack of sleep. I even missed Megan's college graduation because the hardware migration for our surgical scheduling system had to be done that very weekend. And Catherine, ever understanding, told me that maybe saving a few lives was reason enough to be absent from one of my daughter's milestones. Now, with Catherine gone for 8 years, I sometimes wonder if I overcommitted to my role as the hospital's silent guardian. But the truth is, I couldn't stand the idea of letting someone die on my watch for something as preventable as a technical failure. Everything changed the winter Dr. Harrison retired. The board, enticed by flashy credentials and the lure of cost-cutting, brought in Director Simon Caldwell to replace him. And with that came whispers of efficiency audits and modernization strategies. I tried to give Caldwell the benefit of the doubt, but the first red flag appeared when he continually missed our IT briefings, preferring to shuffle through phone calls or scribble notes about unrelated matters instead of focusing on our intricate network. His demeanor, impatient at best and dismissive at worst, foreshadowed the trouble that arrived in the form of Connor's consulting group, which spouted buzzwords like digital transformation, cloud migration, and system overhaul, without ever asking how these changes might impact the doctors who needed instantaneous access to patient records, or the nurses who had to trust that the electronic prescribing platform would not glitch mid-shift. I watched them stick color-coded charts on conference room walls, marking connections they only half understood. And when I tried to explain that we relied on 17 different platforms each, of which had evolved over time to meet urgent, real-world needs, they waved me off with a practiced, condescending smile. My memos detailing the labyrinth of specialized code or the complex security measures we had carefully layered against potential threats went unanswered, and the few polite email replies came with no follow-up. Then one Friday, I found construction crews measuring my office, mumbling something about renovations, which was clearly just a precursor to my eventual removal. Though I updated my resume that same night, part of me refused to believe they would push aside the person who knew the intricacies of every module, every custom API, and every manual failsafe put in place to protect human lives. In that final week before the hospital discovered the extent of its loss, I struggled with an odd mixture of anger, heartbreak, and resignation. I wanted to scream at them for discarding the countless hours I had spent, ensuring that the hospital never stumbled, even under the worst of circumstances. Yet I also realized that I had documented everything, from the secure location of master passwords to step-by-step instructions for handling crisis, a byproduct of my persistent commitment to never leaving the hospital in the dark. What I failed to anticipate was how meaningless that documentation would become in the hands of people who neither respected its contents nor sought to understand its context. They truly had no idea what they had done by casting me aside so abruptly. St. James's systems were not just a tangle of outdated software or random patches hastily sewn together. They were living, breathing entities that required careful stewardship, continuous observation, and a knowledge bank spanning 15 years of triumphs and close calls. In the eyes of Caldwell and his advisors, though, I was merely an impediment to Progressa's static relic who insisted on reliability while they championed a quick, flashy rebrand. Little did they realize that tearing me away from a structure so deeply woven with my expertise was like uprooting the only support beam holding their new, modern edifice aloft. And so, in the quiet of my suddenly empty home office, I braced myself for the day when St. James would face the real consequences of their gamble, because modernizing systems without truly understanding them can be a dangerous folly, especially when lives are on the line. My phone began ringing early Monday morning, well before I had even finished brewing my first cup of coffee, and when the number flashing on the screen turned out to be Simon Caldwell's, I hesitated just long enough to let it roll over to voicemail. There was no surprise in hearing him speak with forced calm, explaining that the pharmacy system was acting up and that the consultants were having trouble with the integration I had painstakingly stitched into place over the course of 15 years. I could practically picture Connor, that perpetually texting advisor of his, pacing in the background, frantic to show off some shiny quick fix, yet clueless as to where to even begin. I listened to Simon's message in its entirety, absorbing the strain in his voice, then pressed delete without a second thought, remembering how callously he had dismissed me during our last meeting in that cramped office. By lunchtime, I had accumulated 3 more calls, each one more urgent than the last, each voicemail shorter and more desperate, until I finally stopped bothering to check them at all. That evening, as I was tidying up a stack of old tech manuals in my home office, my personal phone buzzed with a number I recognized instantly. Dr. Patel. He seldom used his private line unless it was a genuine crisis, so my heart sank before I even answered. When I picked up, his voice came through uncharacteristically tense. "David, have you heard what happened today? The emergency department lost access to the entire patient history database in the middle of a trauma case, and they had to call 2 other hospitals just to find out whether the patient had any medication allergies. It took 40 minutes to confirm everything. No one was harmed this time, but we got dangerously close." He sighed, sounding exhausted, and I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. "They're talking about reverting to paper charts because none of Simon's new measures are holding up. Have you heard from him?" I chose my next words carefully, forcing my voice to remain calm, even though the frustration burned in my chest. I expressed how sorry I was to hear about the crisis, because deep inside, I never wanted patients to suffer for someone else's arrogance, but I also remembered my severance agreement, which was uncomfortably explicit about not providing assistance after my departure. "Dr. Patel lowered his voice, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Simon keeps asking if anyone has your personal contact info. The consulting team has no clue how your custom scripts and backups work. Honestly, it's turning into complete chaos." My mind drifted to the hidden backup server I had installed behind a maintenance panel, the paper records I had locked in the fireproof safe, and the authentication tokens that would start expiring in under 2 weeks if nobody manually renewed them. The entire hospital infrastructure was a puzzle held together by countless small pieces that I had fitted together over the years. and I realized with cold clarity that no single consultant, no matter how many degrees they held, could replace the lived-in knowledge of over a decade of continuous upkeep. I wished Dr. Patel and the team good luck, then hung up and walked to my desk where I found a business card I had kept for far too long. Jennifer Walsh, Director of Technology at Riverside Medical Center. She had tried recruiting me several times, promising a place where my experience would be genuinely valued, and I decided perhaps it was time to accept the invitation. The next day, which was a Tuesday, I woke up to a flood of emails, each with frantic subject lines. Critical, pharmacy database failure. Urgent, cardiology system. Offline, David. Please reply ASAP. I scrolled through them one by one, noticing how the tone changed from strained politeness to thinly veiled panic. I recalled how I had once worked nights, weekends, and holidays to prevent exactly these types of breakdowns from ever seeing the light of day. No matter how severe the issue, I always found a patch, a workaround, or a direct fix, often sacrificing my own health and family time in the process. Now, reading Simon's pleas, I experienced a strange detachment that teetered on the line between sympathy for the patients and a stubborn certainty that St. James had invited this crisis upon itself. In his final email, he dropped all pretenses. Name your consultant rate. We'll pay anything. Just help us fix this. A part of me felt a pang of regret for the staff I cared about, and the patients who deserved better, but a larger part recognized that I owed St. James nothing after being cast aside so dismissively. I had barely begun drafting a reply, a polite but firm decline, when the doorbell startled me. Through the window, I saw Simon Caldwell standing on my front porch, his tie askew, his expression more weary than arrogant now. I put my laptop aside and braced myself as I opened the door. He tried to muster a smile but managed only a tired grimace, the kind you see on someone who has run out of excuses and is finally desperate enough to humble himself. David, I'm sure you know why I'm here, he began, voice quivering slightly. We're having issues with the new system, and I can't get Connor's team to figure out your old architecture. Everything's falling apart. Oncology can't pull patient protocols. Billing is down half the time, and the emergency room had to turn away nearly a dozen cases. Could we just talk for a minute, please? I stepped aside silently, letting him walk into my living room, where half a dozen boxes of personal belongings still sat unpacked from my abrupt exit. I offered him a chair and waited, curious to see how far he would go to salvage the hospital's rapidly deteriorating systems. He launched into a jumbled explanation of how his plans for modernization had been misunderstood, that the board had demanded instant results, and how no one had anticipated how complex my legacy systems actually were. Hearing him struggle to justify his oversight might have given me some twisted satisfaction, if not for the thought of patients suffering in real time as the hospital's digital backbone continued to collapse. Still, I couldn't ignore how freely he tossed around the word legacy, as if it were some outdated relic unworthy of respect, rather than a proven, reliable foundation that had kept St. James functioning under the most extreme conditions. I realized in that moment that Simon's desperation was as much about protecting his own reputation as it was about patient care, a truth that sent a chill through me. Even so, listening to him practically beg for my help, I felt a swell of conflicting emotions: anger at his arrogance, concern for the welfare of the hospital staff, and a lingering sense of betrayal that I had been deemed expendable after so many years. When he finished speaking, he looked at me as if I held the only life raft in a stormy ocean. I thought back to Dr. Patel's phone call, to the frantic voicemails, and to the unstoppable chain reaction once the system started to break. And I also thought about Jennifer Walsh and the phone call I had made the day before, a conversation that ended in a promise of an official offer letter arriving by the end of the week. Simon waited, perhaps hoping that my loyalty to the patients and staff would eclipse the way he had brushed me aside only a week earlier. Yet I simply took a breath and reminded myself that his choices had led us here, to a hospital on the brink of chaos, to phone lines clogged with urgent pleas, and to an opportunity for me to find a new place where my expertise might finally be valued. The silence between us hung heavy. Eventually, I cleared my throat, unsure whether to feel pity or relief. I realized there were no words that could fix what had been broken so carelessly, at least not on my end, and certainly not on such short notice. If St. James wanted its stable systems back, it would require a deeper acknowledgement of how poorly they had treated the very person who had protected them through every crisis for a decade and a half. Patient care mattered to me. Of course it did, but so did my own worth, which Simon himself had discarded like yesterday's news. As I prepared to give him my answer, I could see his shoulders tense, knowing that no matter what I said, his entire vision of a modernized hospital had already begun crumbling the moment he underestimated the intricate tapestry I had woven into St. James's infrastructure. He had thrown away the best safeguard they ever had without a second thought, and now he would finally understand what it meant to stand on the other side of that door, pleading for help when the damage was all but done. The morning air felt heavy with a tension I couldn't quite name when my phone started vibrating, its screen lighting up with the familiar number I had been ignoring for days. Blake? Part of me wanted to answer, if only to unleash the frustration that had been simmering ever since he dismissed me in that sterile conference room, but I knew better than to hand him my cooperation on a silver platter. I let it ring, the sound echoing through my living room like a stubborn reminder of everything I had left behind, and soon enough, I heard the beep that signaled his voicemail. His voice, tense and oddly subdued, pleaded for a moment of my time, offering whatever consultant fee I desired if I would just pick up and help him unravel the chaos his modern approach had unleashed upon the hospital's fragile systems. I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, concern for the patients who might suffer, anger at Blake's arrogance, and a curious sense of justice watching him grapple with the fallout of his reckless decisions, all coalescing into a calm resolve. I deleted the message without responding, then poured myself another cup of coffee, deciding that a person who couldn't show me an ounce of respect until disaster struck didn't deserve a single second of my expertise. By midday, the phone had rung 3 more times, each voicemail shorter and more insistent than the last, and each one I calmly erased as though it were no more than spam. A few hours after sunset, just as the sky turned a deep indigo, I got a text from Dr. Patel, who had always been a voice of reason at St. James. His words were short and urgent, describing how the pharmacy interface had crashed once again, leaving nurses scrambling for manual charts. The day before, the ER had to delay key trauma treatments because staff couldn't pull up digital records in time, and the entire radiology department was rumored to be on the brink of losing vital imaging data. I pictured the hospital halls awash in frantic energy, medical professionals pushing gurneys, while also juggling endless phone calls to the IT department, only to find that no one there knew the system the way I once did. Even from the outside, I could sense the deepening cracks in Blake's grand plan, and as much as I wanted to empathize with the doctors and nurses, I couldn't ignore how freely he had dismissed me when it served his ambitions. The next morning, a knock on my front door startled me just as I was setting my phone on silent to avoid another barrage of desperate calls. When I pulled back the curtain, there stood Blake himself, looking surprisingly defeated for a man who had so confidently touted his corporate credentials just a week earlier. Gone was the crisp suit jacket and the unwavering certainty in his eyes. His tie hung crooked, his hair looked unkempt, and there was a slight tremble in his hand as he knocked again. I wasn't interested in prolonging this uncomfortable encounter on my doorstep for the neighbors to see, so I stepped aside and let him enter, though I made no attempt to hide my skepticism. He glanced around my small living room, where half-packed boxes still lingered, remnants of 15 years I had dedicated to St. James, now hastily shoved into cardboard and plastic bins. "Ethan," he began, forcing a tight smile that didn't touch his eyes, "I appreciate you letting me come here. We need you." His voice cracked on that final word, a quiet plea that I never imagined I'd hear from the man who'd so casually asked security to escort me out less than 2 weeks ago. He began his litany of what had gone wrong: the new consultant team, short on hospital IT experience, couldn't adapt to the specialized scripts, interfaces, and backup routines I had meticulously nurtured over the years. The pharmacy system was on the brink of a total meltdown, and entire departments were being forced to revert to paper documentation, risking patient safety and compliance with regulations. Even the board, which once trusted Blake's every word, was now breathing down his neck, outraged by the flurry of system failures and the subsequent negative press. He made his pitch, voice trembling between desperation and forced dignity, offering me double my previous salary if I would consent to be a consultant, and ease them through the very transitions he had declared me unfit to oversee. I listened without interrupting, recalling the endless nights I had spent resolving issues so that the doctors, nurses, and patients would never have to face catastrophic delays in treatment or data loss. His admission that change might have been rushed struck me as disingenuously mild, like a hurricane of trouble had arrived, and he only now realized it was more serious than a passing storm. The memory of his condescending tone from our final meeting played in my head, how he claimed my methods were outdated, and how my devotion to reliability had somehow become a liability. He pretended to empathize, to recognize my years of service and the complexity of the system's architecture, but his eyes betrayed him, reflecting a deep fear of failure rather than a newfound respect for my work. When his pitch wound down to an awkward silence, I calmly placed the coffee mug I had been holding onto the table and let my words fall into the room like slow, deliberate drops of rain on a roof. I told him I was sorry the hospital found itself in such dire straits, that I truly felt for the staff who had worked shoulder to shoulder with me for so long, and for the patients who deserved better than a half-finished overhaul. However, I also reminded him that he was the one who forced me out with no regard for the institutional knowledge I carried, and that I had already accepted a new position at Riverside Medical Center Place that had been courting me for years and genuinely valued the experience I brought to the table. I saw his composure slip, his mouth tightening in frustration, and for a moment, I almost wavered, thinking of the critical wards and the vulnerable patients who might suffer because of his miscalculation. Yet I recalled the humiliation of being labeled resistant to change, the sting of having my legacy dismissed, and the weary nights when I had sacrificed everything for an institution that repaid me by kicking me to the curb when a slick presentation by outside consultants promised cheaper, faster solutions. He tried to argue about a non-compete clause, fishing for any contractual loophole he could exploit, but I just shook my head, explaining how I had carefully read my severance agreement, which contained only a non-disclosure provision, not a non-compete. He demanded to know if I was really letting personal grudge stand in the way of patient safety, and I, in turn, reminded him that it was never about a grudge. It was about wanting to be somewhere that actually appreciated the sleepless nights, the holiday weekends spent patching code, and the unwavering commitment to zero downtime in an environment where a few lost seconds could mean losing a life. My voice didn't waver, though inside I felt a surge of mixed relief and regret. Yes, I did still care, deeply so, but I refused to rescue a man who cared nothing for my contributions until he realized that no one else could replicate them. He left with a curt nod and a tremor in his jaw, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I felt the strangest sense of calm. The drama was far from over. St. James would likely continue to unravel under Blake's half-baked leadership, but at least I was free from the weight of sustaining a system that the administration had already rejected as obsolete. In that moment, I understood that sometimes walking away is the most dignified form of survival, especially when you've given everything you have and received only disdain in return. A part of me ached for the nurses and doctors caught in the crossfire of misguided ambition, but I reminded myself that I was not the one who turned their world upside down. Blake had done that all on his own, and now he would face the consequences of believing that real experience, built through countless nights of vigilance, could be replaced with a handful of buzzwords and a slick quarterly report. The sunlight streaming through the window felt oddly comforting the morning after Blake's strained visit, but any fleeting tranquility vanished the moment I turned on the local news and saw the reporter standing outside St. James Hospital, microphone in hand, announcing a series of catastrophic system failures that had thrown multiple departments into a tailspin. She spoke about patients being diverted to neighboring hospitals because the emergency ward's digital infrastructure had collapsed under the weight of ill-planned upgrades, and her voice carried just enough urgency to confirm how serious the situation had become. It was surreal to watch the hospital I had poured my heart into for 15 years, suddenly headlining a crisis, and while part of me wanted to rush in and fix every broken interface and malfunctioning script, I remembered how my dedication had been casually disregarded by those in charge. By mid-morning, my phone chimed with a text from Dr. Patel, who rarely resorted to short messages but had evidently reached his limit. He described how entire units were in disarray, staff morale was in freefall, and new whispers were circulating that maybe the hospital had grossly underestimated the complexity of its own systems. An odd pang of regret welled up in my chest, though I reminded myself that I had tried to warn them time and again that a hasty modernization without understanding the foundational layers would be disastrous. Just as I was steeling myself to ignore the situation altogether, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated, but something told me to answer. A measured, elegant voice identified herself as Dr. Hughes, a board member at St. James whose reputation I recalled as being meticulous but fair. She thanked me for picking up and spoke quietly, as though worried someone in her vicinity might overhear her candid words. With each breath, she explained how the board had discovered evidence suggesting that Blake had deliberately presented inflated cost savings and minimized the risks involved in transitioning to a proprietary system that lacked the critical compatibility we required. According to Dr. Hughes, Helix Solutions' so-called technical assessment of the hospital's infrastructure had intentionally excluded entire modules, painting an incomplete picture of the potential pitfalls and overshadowing the proven stability I had maintained for well over a decade. In the wake of the escalating system failures, she and a growing number of board members had begun tracing the breadcrumbs of these inaccuracies, uncovering a paper trail of misleading data and partial truths that made it painfully clear how drastically they had been misled. Although her tone remained calm, I sensed a quiet anger simmering beneath her words, and she did not shy away from apologizing on behalf of those who had allowed this debacle to unfold under the guise of innovation. She explained that the board had called an emergency meeting, not only to assess the damage, but also to decide how to rectify it before the hospital's reputation sank beyond repair. To my surprise, Dr. Hughes revealed that she had personally insisted on inviting me to testify, or at the very least to share any insights I might have into what had truly gone wrong. In the same measured tone, she acknowledged that my knowledge of the hospital's legacy systems could prove vital for unraveling the knots that Blake's careless approach had created. I found myself listening intently, torn between the long-standing loyalty I felt toward St. James and the sting of betrayal that still lingered after my abrupt dismissal. When Dr. Hughes admitted that many of the board members were furious upon learning how much of the hospital's stability had depended on my carefully curated connections, manual overrides, and specialized scripts, I couldn't help a bittersweet sense of validation. Even so, I calmly reminded her that my severance agreement contained a non-disclosure clause, meaning I was barred from offering direct assistance unless the hospital renegotiated the terms, and I also confessed that I had just accepted a new position at Riverside Medical Center. Rather than reacting with frustration, Dr. Hughes took a measured breath and insisted that she understood my reluctance, yet pleaded that I attend their emergency session in a consulting capacity, if only to clarify the facts and detail how the systems had previously functioned so seamlessly. After we hung up, I stared at my phone, pondering her invitation and the swirl of emotions it brought. A vision of the neglected server rooms flashed through my mind, images of stacked racks and blinking lights that I had painstakingly tended to like a gardener devoted to a delicate hothouse garden. It was impossible to forget the countless nights I had slept beneath my desk, patching one vulnerability or another, so the hospital would never see a day of critical downtime. Now, as patients were being redirected and staff faced mounting chaos, a larger question loomed. Should I return, even briefly, to the place that once discarded me so easily? While I weighed my options, a new email appeared in my inbox. The sender was Dr. Hughes again, this time providing additional details about how the Helix contract had been secured. She wrote that members of the board had been assured by Blake that Helix would seamlessly integrate into St. James's ecosystem with minimal downtime, but it had become disturbingly clear that Helix had never even attempted to properly map the various custom interfaces I had built to keep patient data flowing smoothly between pharmacy, cardiology, and radiology. She confessed a personal sense of guilt, as she was one of the few board members who had questioned the plan from the start, only to be drowned out by Blake's promises and carefully curated performance metrics. The email ended with a heartfelt line that caught me off guard. "I am sorry for the disservice we did to you, and more importantly, to the hospital. I hope you can give us one more chance to make it right." I inhaled slowly, reading that sentence a second time, then a third, remembering the countless times I had pitched incremental upgrades that balanced patient safety with slow, methodical modernization, only for them to be dismissed as too costly or too conservative. Now that the system was on the brink of collapse, the board finally recognized the delicate artistry that goes into maintaining a digital infrastructure in a hospital environment, where seconds could be the difference between life and death. Perhaps they had learned the hard way that expertise cannot simply be replaced overnight without devastating repercussions. In the end, I decided that St. James deserved to hear the truth directly from me. I would not lie or sugarcoat the considerable damage caused by Helix's ill-fated intervention, and I had no intention of papering over the reckless shortcuts that had been taken in the name of modernization. My focus, if I chose to stand before them, would be on the facts, on the intricacies that took me years to piece together, and on the urgent steps they would need to take to prevent further harm. Part of me felt a vindictive spark, a quiet sense of satisfaction at how quickly they had come to realize what they had lost. But another part, the part that had always believed in the mission of a hospital, understood that patient care transcends personal grudges. So I composed a measured reply, agreeing to attend the emergency board meeting and share my findings, but also making it clear that any assistance beyond presenting facts would require a formal restructuring of my previous NDA. I wanted to ensure that St. James valued my expertise not as a mere afterthought, but as a linchpin in restoring the environment I had built with such care. As I hit send, I remembered the hollow ache I felt when I first walked out with my cardboard box of memories. Now, the hospital that had dismissed me as obsolete was reaching out, grasping for the lifeline I represented, which they had carelessly cast aside. Days later, standing in the boardroom with Dr. Hughes at the head of the table, I surveyed the anxious faces of men and women who once barely acknowledged my presence, all of them now hanging on to every word I said. The irony did not escape me, but in that moment, I resolved to speak plainly and precisely about the magnitude of the challenges ahead. Each piece of evidence laid out the short-sighted decisions, the manipulated metrics, and the gaping holes in Helix's integration plan. As I concluded, an uneasy hush fell across the room, and I could see a mixture of shame and relief reflected in their eyes. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard Catherine's voice telling me that saving lives was the ultimate goal, not dwelling on resentment, and I knew she would have approved of me standing there, giving St. James the second chance it so desperately needed, even if they had denied me one when it mattered most. Stepping into the boardroom felt strangely surreal, as though the past months had condensed into this single moment where every claim and every consequence would be laid bare under harsh fluorescent light. At the far end of the table sat Dr. Hughes, composed and resolute, while a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces lined the room's perimeter. Some were department heads I remembered from my years at St. James. Others appeared to be new executives hired during the so-called modernization, but all of them wore expressions that ranged from apprehension to downright fear. I couldn't help noticing a familiar tension in the air, like a storm about to break in. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of pity for Blake, who stood off to the side near a projection screen, his knuckles white against the papers he clutched. Yet I also recalled the dismissive tone with which he'd once told me my methods were obsolete, and that memory hardened my resolve. After a brief welcome, Dr. Hughes cleared her throat, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic gravity. She explained to everyone present that the board had uncovered serious discrepancies regarding Helix Solutions' initial assessment of the hospital's IT infrastructure, and that further investigation revealed it was Blake who had championed this partnership despite multiple red flags. She gestured for me to begin, and all eyes turned in my direction. I connected my laptop to the projector and brought up a carefully organized set of document system blueprints, network diagrams, and comparative analysis charts I had spent the past few days compiling. The first slide displayed a simple but damning side-by-side comparison. On one side, the real architecture I had meticulously built over 15 years, and on the other, the drastically simplified version Helix had submitted to justify their rapid overhaul. A tense silence gripped the room when I began speaking. My voice was steady, though the emotions behind it ran deep. I explained in detail how various subsystems depended on each other for proper data exchange, and how Helix's supposed universal platform would require entire sections of the hospital's operations to be rebuilt from the ground up to maintain even half the reliability we once enjoyed. I had no desire to gloat, but I refused to spare them the grim truth of what had already happened: electronic patient charts going offline in the emergency department, the pharmacy interface crashing unexpectedly, and billing systems teetering on the brink of total failure. Each piece of evidence I presented chipped away at the facade Blake had constructed, and I saw the color drain from his face as the magnitude of his misrepresentation came into focus. Occasionally, someone on the board would interrupt with a question, usually about why Helix had failed to account for the specialized scripts or custom patches that formed the backbone of St. James's stability. Patient data, I explained, was not just a matter of plugging in new software. It required a carefully orchestrated network of fail, safes, and manual overrides designed for worst-case scenarios, all of which had been developed over time to meet the hospital's unique needs. Every time I finished an explanation, I saw realization dawn on yet another board member's face, the subtle shift from confusion to indignation as they understood how thoroughly they had been misled. In the midst of it all, Blake tried to interject a few times, claiming that Helix's long-term benefits would outweigh these minor transition pains, but Dr. Hughes promptly silenced him with a raised hand and a sharp look that cut through his hollow assurances. As I reached the final slides, the severity of the situation became impossible to deny. The charts showed a dramatic increase in system failures, correlating precisely with the phasing out of my legacy safeguards, and Dr. Patel, who was seated near the front, briefly put his head in his hands, muttering that he had never seen so many critical disruptions in such a short span of time. I ended with a summary of the immediate steps needed to stabilize the chaos, rolling back certain Helix modules, reactivating backups that had gone unattended, and fully auditing the changes introduced without proper documentation. And by the time I finished, the boardroom felt as still as a tomb. Dr. Hughes took a measured breath and addressed the entire assembly, stating that the evidence of negligence and misrepresentation was overwhelming. She turned toward Blake with a calm that belied the anger beneath her words, recapping how he had bypassed standard protocols to rush the hospital into a costly contract, how he had handpicked Helix Solutions based on personal incentives rather than proven compatibility, and how his efficiency audit had selectively omitted the very successes and safeguards that had kept St. James's systems robust for years. With clipped precision, she announced that the board had already conferred about severing the Helix contract and would be formally terminating Blake's position as director, effective immediately. A ripple of hushed whispers spread across the table. Blake paled, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lash out, but he caught sight of Dr. Hughes's unwavering gaze and simply fell silent. He glanced around, perhaps searching for a sympathetic face, but found only the same mixture of outrage and disappointment I had seen moments earlier. The finality of his downfall settled upon the room like a weighty verdict, and as he gathered his papers in a trembling hand, it was clear there would be no last-minute redemption for him in this saga. The tension hung heavy until Dr. Hughes turned to me, the strict lines of her expression softening just a fraction. She acknowledged that the hospital would be in dire need of a methodical restoration process in the wake of Helix's disruption, and on behalf of the board, she formally apologized for the way I had been dismissed. While she admitted they could not undo the weeks of chaos or the damage done to my reputation within the organization, she appealed to my sense of responsibility and expertise, asking if I would consider leading the recovery effort and ensuring patient care was no longer endangered by short-sighted decisions. I felt the eyes of every department head in the room on me, many of whom once assumed I would always be there behind the scenes, fixing every glitch and preventing every major meltdown. Part of me relished the vindication of seeing Blake stripped of the authority he had misused, but another part remembered the harried nurses, the exhausted doctors, and the vulnerable patients left in limbo by this disaster. My mind flickered back to the moment I had slipped my badge onto Blake's desk, thinking that perhaps my time at St. James was over for good, and I wondered if returning would be a betrayal of my own pride or a necessary act of salvation for a hospital that truly needed me again. With every pair of eyes resting on me, I replied that I was willing to help, provided there was a genuine commitment to rebuilding the trust and infrastructure Blake had so recklessly dismantled. If I were to step back into that role, I wanted the board to honor the spirit of collaboration Dr. Harrison had once championed, to respect the delicacy of integrating new technology into healthcare, and to guarantee that no shortcuts or hasty decisions would undermine our progress. There was a slight tremor in my voice as I spoke, a manifestation of all the hurt and betrayal I had pushed down for weeks, but I held my gaze steady. As soon as I finished, Dr. Hughes nodded solemnly, then officially called for a vote to dismiss Helix Solutions and instate an emergency restoration plan. The unanimous show of hands was swift, leaving Blake standing off to the side, no longer the influential director he had once pretended to be. The security officers by the door waited for a signal, and when Dr. Hughes gave a discreet nod, they escorted him out, his eyes darting around for one last lifeline that never materialized. In the aftermath, the boardroom brimmed with relieved chatter, but I could still sense the undercurrent of guilt and tension as department heads discussed how best to support the transition back to stable systems. For me, the victory felt tinged with sadness. Blake's downfall, though arguably deserved, was a reminder that ambition without integrity leads only to catastrophe, especially in an environment as critical as a hospital. Dr. Patel approached, quietly placing a hand on my shoulder and whispering a heartfelt apology for the way things had unraveled. I thanked him, knowing that while old wounds might never fully heal, perhaps there was space for reconciliation and renewed purpose. That evening, as I drove home beneath a crimson sunset, I replayed the day's events in my mind, realizing this was not just the end of Blake's tenure, but also a new beginning for St. James. The hospital, wounded but still standing, now had the chance to rebuild properly, leveraging both advanced technology and the hard-earned wisdom of those who truly understood what it takes to keep patients safe. I had never wanted revenge so much as respect for my work and the care of those who depended on it. And as the warm glow of the setting sun faded behind me, I allowed myself a small, hopeful smile at the notion that perhaps, this time around, we could finally strike that balance. 3 weeks after the tumultuous board meeting, I found myself walking back through the familiar corridors of St. James, this time with a newly minted ID badge clipped to my collar that read, Chief Technology Officer. The hospital bustled with a renewed sense of energy. Staff hurried about with papers and tablets. Nurses exchanged quick updates at every station. And I could feel the tension that had weighed so heavily on these halls gradually giving way to cautious optimism. Even the stark fluorescent lighting, which once seemed so unforgiving, now felt like a reminder that the real work had only just begun. Dr. Hughes had wasted no time drafting a thorough plan to reverse the damage inflicted by Helix Solutions, reaching out to me and a small team of trusted IT specialists to guide the restoration effort. As CTO, I had full authority to chart a course that would not only reclaim the stability we once knew, but also carefully implement the kinds of upgrades the hospital truly needed. It was an overwhelming task, especially given the enormous tangle of half-integrated systems Helix had left behind. Yet there was a part of me that thrived on the challenge. I remembered how, for years, I'd worked in the background, ensuring uptime without ever receiving more than a passing nod. Now, my voice was no longer confined to hushed IT briefings, but carried weight in every strategic discussion, whether it involved new hardware acquisitions, cybersecurity protocols, or the potential expansion of telemedicine services. On my first day in the new position, I led a meeting in the same conference room where Blake had once dismissed my contributions. The room was packed with department heads, IT staff, and a few newly appointed administrators who still wore apprehensive looks, uncertain if we could truly restore faith in the hospital's digital core. For a moment, I felt the old pang of bitterness, recalling how quickly they had cast aside my expertise, but I pushed that sentiment down, determined to use this second chance to protect the people who depended on us. With a deep breath, I began outlining the priorities for the next 6 months, restoring lost data from the backups I had installed, reactivating custom interfaces that allowed every part of the hospital to communicate seamlessly, and building a roadmap for incremental modernization so we would never again be cornered into a poorly planned overhaul. Although the list of tasks seemed endless, the sense of unified purpose in the room lifted my spirits. During those frenetic weeks, I practically lived in the server rooms once more, but this time I had a full team sharing the burden. We stayed late into the night, sifting through lines of neglected code, patching vulnerabilities that had emerged, and running stress tests to identify where Helix's integrations had caused the most harm. Dr. Patel frequently stopped by with his trademark box of donuts, a throwback to the days when I was just the system guy, working quietly after hours. He would stand off to one side, sipping coffee and shaking his head at the graphs spiking on our monitors, muttering about how close the hospital had come to outright catastrophe. I would reassure him that, together, we were steering things back toward stability, and he would nod, mumbling that it was a comfort just knowing I was at the helm. The narrative had shifted almost overnight. No longer was I simply the invisible backbone overshadowed by talk of modernization, but I was now the person the entire hospital looked to for guidance, a fact that was both exhilarating and daunting. My new title brought invitations to meetings where I could finally advocate for the practical, evidence-based improvements I had dreamed about for years. Instead of glancing at their watches or deferring to consultants with slick presentations, the board members, newly shaken by Helix's failures, listened attentively when I explained how crucial it was to maintain certain legacy protocols until our new systems were fully tested. They actually asked questions, eager to avoid another fiasco, and this willingness to learn made me hopeful that a genuine culture shift was happening at St. James. Although many of my nights were still spent typing away on console screens, analyzing error logs, or reviewing security patches, I found that I no longer carried the same bitterness I once felt. Yes, I had been unfairly dismissed, but in some strange twist of fate, that betrayal had led to an even stronger position on that allowed me to champion reliability and patient safety at the highest levels. The hospital's leadership, from Dr. Hughes to the most junior board member, had witnessed firsthand the disastrous results of ignoring solid, experience-based counsel, and they seemed eager never to repeat that mistake. About a month into my new role, St. James held its annual staff appreciation dinner. In past years, I had typically been too busy behind the scenes, overseeing late-night system updates, to attend. This time, though, Dr. Hughes insisted I be front and center. Wearing a suit that felt oddly stiff after spending so many hours in a standard-issue tech polo, I walked into the auditorium and discovered a surprising sight. Hundreds of nurses, doctors, and various department employees, many of whom I had helped or worked with over the years, all standing and clapping as I entered. My cheeks heated with a mix of pride and embarrassment, but a genuine warmth flooded through me when I realized how sincerely they valued the stability I had once provided and that I was now providing again. A brief ceremony followed, during which Dr. Hughes presented an award for excellence in healthcare technology to the entire IT department, insisting that every member who helped rebuild the system from Helix's rubble deserved recognition. Standing on that stage, flanked by colleagues old and new, I remembered the moment I had walked out of St. James with a cardboard box under my arm, feeling as though every sleepless night had been dismissed in the span of a 20-minute meeting. Now, though, the same halls echoed with genuine gratitude. It wasn't just me who had come full circle. It was an entire institution, waking up to the reality that innovation and respect for experience can and should go hand in hand. When I returned home that evening, the plaque from the ceremony tucked under one arm, I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection on the back deck. The sun was just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, and the hush of the fading day gave me space to breathe in everything that had happened. I thought about Blake and whether he had learned anything from the repercussions of his reckless strategy, or if he was already busy selling another hospital on the same empty promises. A small part of me still harbored anger at how he had upended my life and nearly derailed an entire medical center's operations, but a larger part felt relief that I could now dedicate my skills to a place that, at long last, seemed to appreciate them. I took the ID badge from my Poketa badge that named me as the Chief Technology Officer and turned it over in my hand, letting the significance sink in. Though I had once believed that my story with St. James ended in that old office where I relinquished my access card, fate had offered a second act, one in which my experience became the driving force rather than a footnote. No longer relegated to patching holes in silence, I could help steer the hospital toward safer shores, ensuring that no consultant's glossy slideshow would ever override the genuine needs of the medical staff or compromise patient care. In the end, maybe that was the real victory, not a simple revenge, but the hard-won realization that knowledge and loyalty still held immense value, and that the hospital had, in its own complicated way, finally recognized it too. If you've been moved by the twists and turns of this story and want to see more tales of perseverance, dramatic comebacks, and hard-earned triumphs, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for future episodes that delve deeper into the resilience and resolve of people who refuse to be underestimated